At 12:42, on July 20th, 1944, a briefcase packed with British plastic explosive detonated 3 feet from Adolf Hitler, and the most powerful man in Europe was torn apart inside a wooden hut at the Wolf's Lair. There was no concrete bunker to absorb the blast that day. The stifling summer heat had pushed the midday conference into a flimsy timber barracks at Rustenburg, and the thin walls did nothing to contain the pressure wave. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army and one of the few conspirators with access to the Führer's briefings, had armed his charge in a washroom only minutes earlier. Interrupted, he set the pencil fuse on a single block of explosive rather than 2. In the history we know, an officer named Heinz Brandt unknowingly nudged the heavy briefcase behind the solid oak table support, and that ordinary gesture shielded Hitler and doomed the plot. Here, the briefcase stays where Stauffenberg left it. The table support shields no one. When the smoke clears, Hitler is among the dead. For decades, the men who planned this killing had been dismissed as too cautious, too late, too divided to matter. They were colonels and field marshals, conservative aristocrats, and disillusioned bureaucrats, bound less by love of democracy than by the conviction that the regime was leading Germany into annihilation. By July 1944, that annihilation looked certain. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Because the bomb that failed in our world is only the beginning of the question. What no one in that ruined hut understood yet was that killing Hitler was the easiest part of what came next. The signal that went out from Berlin that afternoon carried a single, electrifying certainty: the Führer is dead. In the real timeline, that certainty never existed. Hitler lived, made phone calls, and within hours the wavering commanders who held the fate of the coup in their hands chose obedience to a living master over loyalty to a corpse. The plot unraveled because the lie at its center could not hold. But with Hitler genuinely dead, the machinery the conspirators had prepared finally turns. Operation Valkyrie, a legitimate contingency plan to deploy the reserve army in the event of internal collapse, had been quietly rewritten by the plotters into an instrument of seizure. Now Friedrich Olbricht and Stauffenberg issue the orders from the Bendler block, and this time the garrison commanders comply. Reserve army units move into the government quarter of Berlin, ringing the ministries. In Paris, the military governor arrests the SS and SD command across France in a matter of hours, as he very nearly did even in our timeline. In Vienna, troops occupy the Gestapo offices before the regime can mount resistance. The crucial difference is doubt removed. Soldiers follow orders when the chain of command is clear, and the death of the dictator makes it clear. For one night, the apparatus of the Wehrmacht becomes the apparatus of a coup. Yet occupying buildings is not the same as governing a nation, and the men toasting their success in Berlin knew the most dangerous power in Germany had not yet been touched. Heinrich Himmler was the regime's second nervous system. As chief of the SS and commander of the replacement army, he held a power base that rivaled the generals and answered only to Hitler. The conspirators understood that a coup against the state meant nothing if the black uniformed apparatus survived intact. So the arrest orders go out alongside the Valkyrie signals. Army units move against SS headquarters and the concentration of police power, and Himmler, caught between the death of his patron and the speed of the soldiers, is detained and within days dead. The men who built the machinery of the camps suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of the rifles. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels is the other danger. In the real July 20th, it was Goebbels who kept his nerve, reached Hitler by telephone, and turned a loyal officer back toward the regime, breaking the coup in the capital. Here there is no telephone call to make. The plotters move first on the broadcasting facilities, seizing the radio before the propaganda minister can rally the faithful. His appeals are cut off mid-sentence. The voice that had narrated 12 years of the Reich falls silent on the airwaves. By dawn, the symbols of Nazi authority are in army hands. But seizing a regime is not the same as replacing it, and Germany now faced a question it had not asked since 1933. Who governs? Ludwig Beck steps forward as head of state, the former army chief of staff who had resigned in protest years before, now the designated leader of a provisional government. Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, the civilian conservative long slated to be chancellor, takes the reins of administration. Their first proclamation declares the end of National Socialist rule and the restoration of law. It is a careful, deliberately limited revolution. The new government does not dismantle the Wehrmacht. It depends on it. The front lines are kept manned, the generals kept in place, the soldiers told that their duty to defend Germany has not changed, only the men in Berlin who command them. This is the uncomfortable truth the conspirators carried. They were not a clean break from Germany's wartime conduct. Many had served the regime's campaigns, looked away from its crimes, and turned against Hitler only when defeat became unavoidable. Their new government was a government of generals and conservative officials, not of the persecuted. They sought to save Germany from total destruction, and to do that they needed the war to stop. So Goerdeler turned his attention west, toward the only door that might open, and toward the bitter discovery of how firmly the Allies had decided to keep it shut. The plan had always rested on a single gamble, that the Western powers would prefer a respectable German government to the chaos of total collapse. Goerdeler opens back-channel talks through the neutral capitals Stockholm, Bern, the Vatican, carrying an offer. Germany would lay down its arms in the West, withdraw from the occupied countries, and accept an armistice, provided the Western Allies helped hold the line against the Soviet Union in the East. It was, in the conspirators' minds, a reasonable bargain. The Wehrmacht still held a continuous front against the Red Army. The Eastern Front, though battered by the Soviet Operation Bagration that had shattered Army Group Center in June, had not yet broken. Behind the offer lay a calculation as old as the war itself, that the alliance between the capitalist West and the communist East was unnatural and brittle, and that a new German government might split it. The generals believed they were offering the Western powers exactly what they secretly wanted, a buffer against Stalin. They had misjudged almost everything about the men they were dealing with. The consequences of that misjudgment would prove decisive. But to understand why the door stayed shut, we have to understand a promise the Allies had made 18 months earlier and had no intention of breaking. At Casablanca, in January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill had committed publicly and irrevocably to one demand: unconditional surrender. There would be no negotiated peace, no separate deals, no armistice that left a German government bargaining for terms. The policy existed precisely to prevent what Goerdeler was now attempting, a repeat of 1918, when Germany surrendered and then spent 20 years insisting it had been stabbed in the back rather than beaten. The Western leaders would not hand the next generation of German nationalists that same myth. And there was Stalin. The alliance with the Soviet Union was built on a shared vow that none of the three powers would seek a separate peace. Roosevelt and Churchill knew that the surest way to drive Stalin into his own arrangement with Berlin was to be caught making one of their own. So the answer came back through the neutral channels, cold and unambiguous. There would be no separate peace. The new men in Berlin were welcome to surrender unconditionally to all the Allies at once, or to keep fighting and be destroyed. Meanwhile, indifferent to the change of government, the Soviet armies kept rolling westward. The diplomatic gamble had failed completely. Now the generals faced the consequence they had hoped to avoid, and made the coldest decision of all. Refused in the West and pressed in the East, the government of generals chose the only path that served their deepest instinct: limit the Soviet reach into Germany. They ordered a fighting withdrawal on the Eastern Front, trading ground for time, while quietly accelerating the collapse of resistance in the West, where Hitler had demanded that every position be held to the last man. The new command let the Western Front dissolve, opening the way for American and British armies to drive deep into the Reich before the Red Army could arrive. It was not surrender as the Allies had defined it. It was surrender as the generals could stomach it, a race to be occupied by the West rather than the East. The fighting did not stop cleanly. Pockets of SS and fanatical loyalists resisted the new government even as the fronts gave way, and the withdrawal in the East cost lives by the tens of thousands. But the strategic logic was brutal and clear. Every mile the Western armies advanced was a mile the Soviets would not hold. By accelerating defeat in the West and slowing it in the East, the Wehrmacht government reshaped the map of the occupation while the surrender was still being arranged. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed. The end of the war itself, arriving nearly a year before it did in our own timeline. The war in Europe ends in the late summer of 1944, roughly a year before the real surrender at Reims and Berlin. The difference is not only the calendar. In our history, Germany fought to utter destruction, its government a smoking ruin, its leader dead by his own hand in a bunker, the truth of its crimes uncovered by foreign armies marching into the camps. Here, the regime is toppled from within, by Germans, and that fact reshapes everything that comes after. The occupation lines fall further east, because the Western armies arrived first. Millions who died in the war's final year, soldiers, civilians, and the regime's victims still inside the camps might instead have lived. Yet there is no clean redemption in this earlier peace. The men who govern the new Germany are generals and conservatives, many complicit in the very war they ended, and the reckoning for the regime's crimes becomes tangled in their compromised hands. A Germany that overthrew its own dictator will tell a different story about itself than a Germany beaten flat, and not always a more honest one. The Cold War opens earlier and colder, with Stalin embittered by a Western peace he believes was made behind his back, and the line dividing Europe drawn in a different, sharper place. The bomb behind the table's support, in the world we know, killed the plot and not the man. Move it a few feet and you do not get a tidy ending. You get an earlier one, a colder one, and a reminder that the hardest part of ending a war was never the killing. It was deciding what kind of peace a guilty nation deserved to live in afterward.